Marry her, or admit you're nothing without your money. The words cut through the laughter like a blade, sharp enough to silence even the loudest voices in the room. And for a second, Ethan Cole just stood there, a crystal glass of aged bourbon frozen halfway to his lips, the golden liquid catching the soft glow of the chandelier above, as if time itself had hesitated to move. And then the laughter came back, louder this time, richer, dripping with the kind of arrogance only old money could afford, echoing off marble floors and polished walls in a penthouse that overlooked all of Manhattan like it owned the city, because in many ways, it did, and Ethan was at the center of it all, the youngest CEO in the room, the man who had turned a struggling company into a billion-dollar empire before most people his age had figured out what they wanted in life. And yet tonight, surrounded by men who measured worth in power and women who measured status in last names, he felt something else creeping in, something quieter, sharper, pride, the kind that doesn't like being questioned, especially not in front of an audience, especially not by someone who had just leaned back in a velvet chair and smirked like they already knew the outcome. What's wrong, Cole? The voice pressed again, smooth, amused, dangerous in the way only someone who knew your weaknesses could be. Afraid you can't pull it off? Ethan's jaw tightened just enough to betray the flicker of irritation beneath his calm exterior, his fingers tapping once against the glass before he set it down with deliberate control, the soft clink against the table sounding louder than it should have, like a decision being made. And his eyes swept the room, past the tailored suits and diamond watches, past the knowing smiles and raised brows, until they landed somewhere no one else was looking, near the edge of the room, where the lighting didn't quite reach, where the laughter didn't quite carry, where she stood, quiet, invisible, holding a tray she hadn't moved in the last 30 seconds, as if she had learned long ago that the safest place in a room like this was where no one chose to see you. Amara Johnson didn't belong in that world, and everyone knew it without saying a word, her uniform simple, pressed but worn at the edges, her posture straight but unassuming, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid attention but not enough to suggest weakness. And in a room built on power, she was the absence of it, which made what happened next feel almost unreal, even to the people watching, because Ethan didn't hesitate, not after that moment, not after that challenge had settled into his chest like a spark waiting for oxygen. Fine, he said, his voice calm, almost bored, but carrying across the room with the weight of something final. I'll do it. And just like that, the room went still again, the laughter cutting off mid-breath, curiosity snapping into place where amusement had been seconds before, and someone leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Do what? Ethan didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone except her, and when he spoke again, it wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. I'll marry her. And the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged, electric, the kind that makes people shift in their seats without realizing why. Because suddenly, this wasn't just a joke anymore. It was something else, something unpredictable, and every gaze in the room turned in the same direction, following his line of sight until it landed on the one person who hadn't moved, who hadn't reacted, who hadn't even lifted her head yet. Amara stood there, the tray steady in her hands, as if the words hadn't been directed at her, as if the entire room hadn't just pivoted around her existence. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one laughed, no one breathed too loudly, because they were waiting to see if she would flinch, if she would refuse, if she would remind them that this was absurd, that this was cruel, that this was a man with too much power treating a life like a game. But she didn't do any of that, not immediately. Instead, she slowly lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting Ethan's across the room with a steadiness that didn't belong to someone in her position, didn't belong to someone who had just been turned into the center of a bet. And something in that look made the air feel heavier, made the space between them feel smaller, like the rest of the world had quietly stepped back. And when she spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't trembling. It wasn't anything the room had expected. When is the wedding? The words landed softly, but the impact was anything but a ripple moving through the crowd, confusion flashing across faces that had been so certain of how this would play out, because this wasn't the reaction they had paid to see. This wasn't embarrassment or anger or desperation. This was something else entirely, something controlled, something deliberate, and Ethan felt it before he understood it. A shift, subtle but undeniable, like the rules of a game had just changed without anyone announcing it. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her now, really studying her, for the first time since he had spoken, and for a fraction of a second, something unfamiliar flickered beneath his confidence. Not doubt exactly, but awareness, the kind that tells you might not be as far ahead as you thought, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same calm certainty that had built his empire. Saturday, he said, as if the decision had always been that simple, as if marrying a woman he didn't know was just another item on a schedule, another move in a game he had already decided he would win, and the room erupted again. But this time it wasn't laughter, it was something sharper, something more excited, phones discreetly lifted, whispers spreading like wildfire, because this wasn't just a bet anymore. It was a spectacle, a story, something that would be talked about long after the night ended. And at the center of it all stood two people who couldn't have been more different, one surrounded by power, the other standing quietly within its shadow. And as the noise swelled back to life, as glasses clinked and voices rose, and the city continued to glow beyond the windows, neither of them looked away, because somewhere between the challenge and the answer, between the arrogance and the calm acceptance, something had shifted, something neither of them fully understood yet, and if anyone in that room had been paying close enough attention, they might have realized that this was the moment everything stopped being a joke and started becoming something far more dangerous. Do you even know what you just agreed to? The question followed her before she reached the service hallway, slipping past the polished laughter and into the quieter, colder part of the building, where the lights were harsher and the air no longer carried the scent of expensive perfume, but something more real, more ordinary. And Amara did not stop walking at first, her steps measured, steady against the marble that slowly gave way to plain tile, the sound of her shoes softer now, almost swallowed by the distance she was putting between herself and that room. But the voice came again, closer this time, sharper. I asked you something. And she paused, just for a second, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tray before she turned. Not quickly, not defensively, just enough to face the man who had followed her out of a world she was never meant to stand in the center of. Ethan Cole did not look like he belonged in a service corridor, the tailored lines of his suit too precise, too intentional for a place designed to be unseen. But he stood there anyway, his expression unreadable in a way that suggested he was not used to not understanding a situation. And, for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the party now distant, muted, like it belonged to another reality entirely. You said Saturday, Amara replied finally, her voice calm, almost thoughtful, as if they were discussing something far less absurd than a marriage decided in under 60 seconds. That gives us 5 days. Ethan blinked once, a subtle break in the control he had carried so easily upstairs. This is not a scheduling exercise, he said, his tone lower now, more focused. It is a bet, and there it was, the word hanging between them, stripped of the laughter and the audience that had made it feel like entertainment, now exposed for what it really was, something reckless, something careless, something that had the power to change a life. And yet she did not react the way he expected. No anger, no pleading, no attempt to renegotiate her position. Instead, she nodded once, as if confirming a detail already understood. Yes, she said, it is, and that was when something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because he had expected resistance, expected her to remind him of the imbalance, to point out the unfairness, but she did none of that, and it left him with nothing to push against, nothing to dismiss, which was far more unsettling than any argument could have. Ben, then why would you agree? He asked, the question coming out more direct than he intended, as if he needed the answer to re-establish the structure of a situation that was starting to feel less predictable, and she held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to make it clear that she was choosing her response, not reacting to him. Because you offered something, she said, and I accepted it. Ethan let out a quiet breath, a sound that almost resembled a laugh, but did not quite reach that point. That is not an answer, he said. That is a deflection. And for the first time, something faint touched her expression, not a smile exactly, but something close to it, something that suggested she was aware of the game he was trying to play, and perhaps had no intention of playing it the same way. Then maybe you asked the wrong question, she replied, and the silence that followed was heavier than the one upstairs. Because this one did not have an audience to absorb it, did not have noise to soften its edges. It was just the two of them, standing in a place where power looked different, where titles and wealth did not carry the same immediate weight. And Ethan found himself studying her again, not as an idea, not as a statement, but as a person, the way she stood, the way she spoke, the absence of hesitation where there should have been plenty. You understand what happens next, he said after a moment, his voice steadier now, reclaiming some of the authority that had slipped. There will be contracts, terms, conditions. This is not real. She finished for him, her tone even, not dismissive, not emotional, just precise. I know. And again, no hesitation, no confusion, just acknowledgement, as if she had already walked through every implication in her mind and found them acceptable. Good, he said, a little more quickly than necessary. Then we are clear. And he turned slightly, as if to leave, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. But something stopped him, something small, persistent, the same feeling that had surfaced when she first met his gaze, and before he could dismiss it, he spoke again. You are not curious? She tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration. About what? About why you, he said. And there it was, the question beneath the question, the one that had been there from the beginning. Because in a room full of people who would have said yes for 1,000 different reasons, he had chosen her, and he did not entirely know why. And perhaps that was what unsettled him most. And she considered that for a moment, her eyes steady, thoughtful. No, she said finally, because it does not change anything. And for a second, he did not respond, because he was used to being the one who defined what mattered, the one who decided which details carried weight and which did not. And yet she had just removed the importance from his decision entirely, reduced it to something irrelevant, and that was not a position he found himself in often. Everything changes, he said, quieter now. And this time, she did smile. Just a little, not in amusement, not in defiance, but in something that felt almost like certainty. We will see, she replied, and then she turned, not waiting for dismissal, not seeking permission, simply continuing down the hallway as if the conversation had ended on her terms, leaving him standing there for a moment longer than he intended, the quiet pressing in around him, the echo of her words settling into a place he could not immediately categorize. And as he finally stepped back toward the noise, toward the world where everything was predictable again, one thought lingered, sharper than the rest. This was supposed to be simple, and somehow it already was not. Read every line before you sign anything in this building, the lawyer said without looking up, his voice flat, practiced, as if he had delivered the same warning 100 times to people who never listened. But Amara Johnson did not move, did not reach for the pen placed precisely in front of her. Instead, she sat across the long glass table with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture calm, composed, as if she had been in rooms like this before, even though everything about her presence suggested she should not belong here. The office itself overlooking Fifth Avenue from 40 floors above, walls lined with dark wood and framed degrees that carried more weight than most people's entire lives. And yet she did not seem intimidated, not by the height, not by the silence, not by the man seated at the head of the table who had built his reputation on control. Ethan Cole watched her closely, his expression neutral, but his attention sharper than it had been the night before. Because this was where things became real, not in a crowded room filled with laughter, not in a hallway where words could still be dismissed as impulsive, but here, in a space where every decision was documented, measured, enforced. We will proceed section by section, the lawyer continued, sliding the contract forward, the thick stack of paper making a soft but heavy sound as it settled between them. This agreement outlines the terms of the marriage, including financial arrangements, public expectations, and private boundaries. Amara nodded once, her gaze lowering to the first page, her eyes scanning the text not quickly, not carelessly, but with a focus that made the room feel quieter, more concentrated, as if even the air had adjusted to her pace, and Ethan noticed it. Immediately, the way she did not skim, did not hesitate, did not ask for clarification right away. instead absorbing the language with a familiarity that did not match the role she had been assigned. Clause 1. The lawyer said, "The marriage will be legally binding for a minimum duration of 12 months, after which it may be dissolved under mutual agreement." Amara's eyes moved steadily across the lines, her expression unchanged. Clause 2. He continued, "Both parties agree to maintain the appearance of a genuine marital relationship in all public settings, including but not limited to corporate events, social gatherings, and media appearances." She paused then, just briefly, her gaze lifting from the page to meet Ethan's across the table, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not agreement, not resistance, but acknowledgement, as if they both understood the performance required, even if they did not yet understand the cost. Clause 3. The lawyer added, "No expectation of emotional or personal involvement beyond the scope of this agreement is implied or required." And that was where most people would have reacted, where discomfort would have surfaced, where questions would have been asked. But Amara simply returned her gaze to the document, turning the page with a quiet precision that suggested she had already anticipated every word. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting against the armrest, watching her more carefully now, because this was not the behavior of someone overwhelmed. This was not hesitation disguised as compliance. This was something else entirely, something controlled, deliberate. "Do you have any questions?" the lawyer asked after a moment, his tone still professional, but carrying a hint of expectation, because there were always questions, always uncertainties, always something that required clarification. But she shook her head once. "Not yet," she said, and the response was simple. But it carried a weight that made Ethan narrow his eyes slightly, because it was not the absence of questions that stood out. It was the implication that there would be some. Just not now. Just not until she had decided which ones mattered. "Very well," the lawyer replied, though his glance toward Ethan suggested a brief uncertainty. "We will proceed to the financial terms." The next pages were detailed, specific, outlining monthly allowances, property access, asset protections, the language, precise in a way that removed emotion entirely, reducing the concept of marriage to numbers and conditions. And still, she did not rush, did not react, simply continued reading, her focus unwavering. And it was only when she reached the final section that she stopped, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the page, her eyes lingering on a paragraph longer than the others. Clause 9. The lawyer said, following her gaze, "Confidentiality. Both parties agree that the nature of this arrangement will remain private and will not be disclosed without mutual consent." Amara's expression did not change, but something in the stillness of her posture suggested she had reached a point of interest, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as calm as it had been from the beginning. "I would like to add a condition." The room shifted slightly, not physically, but in the way attention sharpened, in the way Ethan's posture adjusted just enough to signal that this was not expected. "Go on," he said, his tone controlled. But there was something beneath it now, curiosity, perhaps, or something closer to anticipation. "If the agreement is breached," she continued, her gaze still on the page, "not legally, but ethically, if either party acts in a way that undermines the dignity of the other in a public setting, the contract becomes void immediately." The lawyer blinked once, a small break in his practiced composure. "That is not a standard inclusion," he said. "Carefully, this agreement is designed to protect both parties within the framework of, then it protects me as well," she finished, lifting her gaze to meet Ethan's again. And there it was, the line drawn not with emotion, but with clarity. And for a moment, no one spoke, because this was not a request, it was a boundary, and boundaries were not something Ethan encountered often in situations he controlled. "You are negotiating," he said slowly, more observation than question, and she held his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she replied. "I am." And the silence that followed was different from the others, not uncertain, not tense, but charged with a kind of balance that had not existed before, because for the first time since the bed had been made, the terms were not entirely his, and something about that did not irritate him as much as it should have. Instead, it sharpened his focus, made the situation feel less like a game and more like something worth understanding. "Add it," he said finally, his voice steady. and the lawyer hesitated for only a second before nodding, making a note, the sound of pen against paper louder than expected. Very well, he said. The clause will be included. Amara nodded once, returning her attention to the document. And this time, when she reached for the pen, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a single, deliberate movement as she signed her name. The ink settling into the page with quiet finality, and as Ethan watched her do it, one thought settled into place, clearer now than it had been before. This was no longer just a bet, and whether he liked it or not, the rules had already begun to change. Smile for the cameras, someone whispered just before the doors opened, and for a brief second, the world on the other side felt louder than anything Amara Johnson had ever stepped into, brighter too, the kind of brightness that did not come from light alone, but from attention, from expectation, from the weight of 100 eyes waiting to see something they could talk about later. And when the doors finally parted, that noise rushed in all at once, a wave of voices, camera shutters, and murmurs that carried a single unspoken question. What is she doing here? The ballroom stretched wide and polished beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered light across marble floors like fragments of something fragile, every detail curated to perfection, every guest dressed in a way that suggested they belonged, except for the one detail no one had expected, the bride. Amara stepped forward slowly, not hesitating, not rushing, her dress simple but elegant, tailored in a way that did not try to compete with the room, but refused to disappear within it. And beside her, Ethan Cole stood in a suit that fit him like it had been made for the moment, because, in many ways, it had, his expression composed, controlled, the same look he carried into boardrooms where decisions shaped companies, except this time. The decision standing next to him was not one he fully understood anymore. The whispers began almost immediately, low at first, then building, threads of conversation weaving through the room. Is that her? The maid. This is a joke, right? The words did not need to be loud to be heard. Not when they were repeated enough times. Not when they carried the kind of judgment that did not bother to hide itself. And yet Amara did not react, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, as if the noise belonged to someone else's world, as if she had already decided that it would not reach her. Ethan noticed it, the same way he had noticed everything about her since the moment she said yes, the absence of visible discomfort where there should have been plenty, the calm where there should have been tension, and for a moment, he wondered if she understood just how much attention this would bring. But then again, something told him she did. You can still walk away, he said quietly, just enough for her to hear, his voice carrying a tone that was not quite concern, not quite warning, but something in between, and she turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes without breaking the composure she had held since stepping into the room. Can you? She asked, and the question landed differently than anything else had that day, because it was not about the wedding, not about the room, not about the people watching. It was about him, about the choice he had already made and whether he understood it any better than she did. And for a second, he did not answer, not because he could not, but because he realized that the answer was not as simple as it had been when he first spoke it. Ladies and gentlemen, the officiant's voice cut through the room, smooth and practiced, drawing attention back to the center where it belonged, where they stood, side by side, the focus of something that was no longer just a private decision but a public moment. And as the ceremony began, the words felt distant, formalities layered over a situation that had grown more complex with every passing hour, vows spoken, in language designed to represent something real, something lasting, even when the foundation beneath them had been built in a matter of minutes. Ethan repeated the words when prompted, his voice steady, his tone controlled, but somewhere beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, something he had not accounted for. And when it was her turn, Amara did the same, her voice calm, clear, carrying across the room without effort, without hesitation, as if she had always known how to stand in a space like this, as if the role she had been given was not something she had stepped into, but something she had chosen. And that was the part no one else seemed to notice, the difference between being placed somewhere and deciding to be there, the distinction that separated her from the assumptions being made about her. Do you take each other as husband and wife? The officiant asked, the final question, the one that turned everything from possibility into fact. Ethan's answer came first. Automatic, expected, I do. And then it was her turn, the room holding its breath in a way that suggested people were still waiting for something to go wrong, for her to hesitate, for her to break the illusion they had built around her. But she did not. I do, she said. And the simplicity of it carried more weight than anyone in the room had anticipated, because there was no uncertainty in it, no performance, just a statement, clear and deliberate. And when the officiant declared them married, the reaction was immediate, applause that felt more like observation than celebration, cameras flashing, capturing a moment that would be dissected long after it ended. And as they turned to face the crowd, Ethan became aware of something he had not expected. The way the room looked different now, not because it had changed, but because he had, even if only slightly, even if only enough to notice the details he had ignored before, the expressions, the judgments, the quiet lines that divided people into categories they rarely questioned. And standing beside him, Amara remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, steady, unaffected in a way that did not feel like ignorance, but like choice. And as the music began, as the formalities transitioned into celebration, one realization settled into place, quiet, but undeniable. This was no longer something he could control the way he had intended, because whatever this was becoming, it was no longer following the rules he had set at the start. This is your new home, the house manager said, but the way she said it made it sound less like a welcome and more like a test. And Amara Johnson paused just inside the entrance, her gaze moving slowly across the space in front of her, the kind of space most people only saw in magazines. High ceilings stretching nearly 20 feet above polished floors, walls lined with art that looked expensive even to someone who had never studied it, and windows that framed the city like it belonged to the man who owned this place. And for a moment, she said nothing, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she was observing, taking in details the way she had done in every room she had ever entered, quietly, carefully, as if the environment itself had something to teach her if she paid close enough attention. Your belongings have been moved to the master suite, the house manager continued, her tone precise, professional, but carrying a subtle edge that suggested she did not entirely approve of the situation. Dinner is served at 7, and staff will be available if you require assistance. Amara nodded once, her expression calm. Thank you, she said, and the simplicity of her response seemed to catch the woman off guard for a second, as if she had expected something else, something less composed. But she said nothing further, only giving a small, tight nod before turning and leaving, her footsteps echoing faintly as she disappeared down the hallway. And just like that, the house fell quiet, the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, controlled, as if even sound had rules here. Amara stood there for a moment longer, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of a nearby table, not out of curiosity, but out of grounding, as if reminding herself that this place, as distant as it felt from anything she had known, was now part of her reality, at least for now. You are settling in faster than expected. Ethan's voice came from behind her, low, measured, and she turned slightly, not startled, just aware, finding him leaning casually against the doorway, his jacket already removed, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested this space belonged to him in every sense of the word. I prefer to understand my surroundings, she replied, her tone even, and he studied her for a moment, that same look he had worn since the contract was signed, as if trying to solve something that did not present itself easily. Most people would be overwhelmed, he said, stepping further into the room, his eyes moving briefly across the space before returning to her. Most people are not me, she answered, and there it was again, not defiance, not arrogance, just a statement of fact, delivered without hesitation, and for a second, the corner of his mouth almost lifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest he recognized the difference. Dinner is in 30 minutes, he said after a moment. You will need to change. Her gaze dropped briefly to her uniform, still neat, still pressed, but clearly out of place in a setting like this, and she nodded once. Of course, she said, and he turned to leave, but paused just before stepping out. There are rules, he added, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more defined, more deliberate. We maintain appearances in public, We do not interfere with each other's professional responsibilities, and we keep personal boundaries clear. Amara listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, and when he finished, she met his gaze steadily. I read the contract, she said, and something in her voice suggested that she had not just read it, but understood it in a way that extended beyond the words on the page. Good, he replied, though there was a hint of something else beneath the word, something that suggested he was not entirely convinced the situation would remain as controlled as he intended, and then he left, his footsteps fading as he moved deeper into the house, leaving her alone again in a space that still felt like it was watching her. The master suite was larger than any apartment she had ever lived in, the bed positioned perfectly in the center, the sheets crisp, untouched, the kind of arrangement that suggested order, precision, expectation, and for a moment, she stood in the doorway, her gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in the details, the subtle ones, the ones most people would overlook, the absence of personal items, the lack of warmth, the sense that this was a place designed for function rather than comfort. And then she stepped inside, setting her small bag down carefully on a chair that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent, her movements measured, intentional, as if she refused to let the scale of the space dictate her behavior. She moved to the closet, opening it to reveal rows of clothing already arranged by color and style, dresses she had never worn, fabrics she had never touched, and for a moment, her fingers hovered over them, not in hesitation, but in consideration, and then she selected one, simple, elegant, something that did not try to compete with the space but fit within it, and as she changed, the quiet of the room settled around her again, but this time, it felt different, not unfamiliar, but transitional, as if she was standing between two versions of herself, one that had existed before this moment, and one that was beginning to take shape now. When she returned to the dining room, Ethan was already there, seated. At the long table, his posture relaxed but controlled, a glass of water placed precisely to his right, and as she entered, his gaze lifted, pausing on her for a fraction longer than necessary, not because of the dress, not because of the setting, but because of the way she carried herself within it, as if she had not been placed here, but had chosen to be here, and that distinction, subtle as it was, made all the difference. You look appropriate, he said, and the words could have been taken as approval, but his tone made them sound more like observation, and she nodded once, taking her seat across from him. So do you, she replied, and the exchange was simple, almost formal, but beneath it, there was something else, something unspoken, something that neither of them had fully defined yet. Dinner was served quietly, efficiently, the staff moving in and out of the room without drawing attention, and for a while, neither of them spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, but not entirely neutral either. It was the kind of silence that carried awareness, that acknowledged the shift that had taken place without needing to name it. And as the meal continued, Ethan found himself noticing things he had not expected to notice. The way she held her utensils, the way she moved, the absence of awkwardness where it should have existed, and it left him with a thought he could not quite ignore. This was not how this was supposed to feel, because somewhere between the bet, the contract, and the ceremony, something had changed, something subtle, something that did not announce itself, but made itself known all the same. And as he looked at her across the table, one realization settled quietly into place. This arrangement was no longer as simple as he had intended, and for the first time, he was not entirely sure he was the one in control. Do not speak unless you are spoken to, the woman said with a thin smile that never reached her eyes, her voice low but sharp enough to carry across the polished floor, and for a moment, the room seemed to pause just slightly, as if waiting to see how Amara Johnson would respond. The charity gala unfolding around them in layers of soft music, quiet conversations, and the subtle clinking of glasses. The kind of environment where every word mattered more than it appeared, and Amara stood still, her posture steady, her expression composed, her gaze resting on the woman in front of her without flinching, without lowering, without offering the reaction that had clearly been expected. I was not aware that respect required permission, she replied, her voice calm, even, not loud, but precise enough to shift the air between them, and for a second, the woman's smile tightened. her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if recalculating something she had assumed would be simple. "You should be careful," she said, her tone soft but edged with something colder. "People here do not forget their place." Amara did not answer immediately, not because she had nothing to say, but because she chose not to give the moment more weight than it deserved, and instead, she turned her attention back to the room, to the movement, to the rhythm of a space that had already revealed more than it intended. The gala was everything it was meant to be: elegant, controlled, a display of wealth and influence wrapped in the language of generosity. Tables arranged with precision, guests moving through the space with the ease of familiarity, as if they had always belonged there, as if belonging was something inherited rather than earned. And yet beneath that surface, there was something else, something quieter, something less polished. The way conversations shifted when certain people approached, the way glances lingered just a second longer than necessary, the way assumptions were made without being spoken. Ethan Cole watched it all from across the room, his expression unreadable, but his attention fixed, not on the event itself, but on her, the way she moved through the space without shrinking, without overcompensating, without trying to prove anything to anyone, and it unsettled him more than he expected, because this was supposed to be a test, a situation designed to expose discomfort, to highlight differences, to reinforce the imbalance he had built into it from the beginning. But she was not reacting the way the situation demanded. She was not fitting into the role that had been assigned to her, and it made everything feel slightly off, slightly unpredictable. "Your wife is drawing attention," a voice said beside him, smooth, amused, and Ethan did not need to turn to know who it was. That was the point, was it not? He replied, his tone neutral, but there was something beneath it now, something sharper, something that suggested the situation was no longer as entertaining as it had been the night it started. "Careful," the voice continued. "Attention can turn quickly." And Ethan's gaze remained steady, his focus still on her as she moved through the crowd, as conversations shifted around her, as expectations adjusted in real time. And for a moment, he considered stepping in, redirecting the energy, reasserting control, but he did not move. Not yet, because there was something he needed to understand first, something about the way she carried herself that did not align with the narrative that had been built around her. "You seem comfortable," he said when he finally approached her, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, but clear enough to signal his presence, and she turned slightly, meeting his gaze with the same steadiness she had shown from the beginning. "I am observant," she replied, and the distinction was subtle, but it mattered, because comfort implied acceptance, while observation implied awareness, and those were not the same thing. "You handled that well," he added, referencing the earlier exchange without naming it, and she tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in consideration. "Handled what?" she asked, and for a second, he almost smiled, not because the question was genuine, but because it was intentional, because she had chosen not to acknowledge the insult, not to give it space, not to let it define the moment, and that, more than anything else, shifted the balance of the situation in a way he had not anticipated. "You are learning quickly," he said instead, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, just long enough to make it clear that she understood the implication. "I was not aware that this required learning," she replied, and there it was again, the quiet deflection, the refusal to accept the premise he was offering, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the gala continuing around them, but somehow distant, as if they were standing slightly outside of it, observing rather than participating, and then, without warning, the room shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that drew immediate attention, but enough for those paying close attention to notice the subtle change in energy, the way conversations paused, the way glances redirected, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. The presence of someone who carried weight in a way that could not be ignored, and when he turned, his expression changed, not visibly, not in a way most people would recognize, but just enough to signal recognition, calculation, something more complex than the control he had maintained so far. "Well," the same voice from earlier returned, softer now, more deliberate. "This should be interesting," and Amara followed Ethan's gaze, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, but something in the stillness of her presence suggested that she understood, that whatever was about to happen was not random, not accidental, but part of a larger pattern she had already begun to see. And as the distance between them and the approaching figure closed, as the space around them adjusted to accommodate the shift, one realization settled quietly into place. This was not just a test of appearances anymore. It was a test of power, and for the first time since the bet had been made, it was no longer clear who was being tested. "You really should have chosen someone else," the woman said as she stepped into their space, her presence quiet but commanding in a way that made the air around them shift almost instantly. Conversations nearby slowing just enough to signal awareness, and Ethan's posture adjusted in response, subtle but deliberate, as if this was not just another guest, but someone whose opinion carried consequences. "Victoria," he acknowledged, his tone controlled, neutral, but there was a tension beneath it. Now, something restrained, something that suggested history, and Amara stood beside him, still, composed, her gaze moving from Ethan to the woman with calm precision, taking in the details without reacting. Victoria Hale was everything the room expected, poised, polished, her confidence effortless in a way that came from never having to question her place. And when her eyes landed on Amara, the faintest hint of a smile appeared, not warm, not welcoming, but measured, evaluative. "So this is the decision," she said, her voice smooth, almost conversational, but carrying an edge that made the words feel heavier than they sounded. "You always did have a talent for surprises." Ethan did not respond immediately, his attention fixed, calculating, but Amara spoke first, her voice calm, steady, cutting through the moment with quiet clarity. "And you must be someone who expected to be consulted." The words were not sharp, not confrontational, but they landed with precision, and for a second, Victoria's expression shifted, just slightly, enough to reveal that the response had not been anticipated. "I am someone who understands how these things work," she replied, her tone still composed. But there was something firmer beneath it now, something that suggested she was no longer entirely in control of the interaction. "This is not a game," Amara said, her gaze steady, and the statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it rejected the premise that had been built around her. Rejected the idea that she was a piece in something designed by someone else. And for a moment, the silence that followed was different from the others, not uncertain, not tense, but charged with a kind of clarity that made everything else in the room feel less important. "No," Victoria said slowly, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "It is not." And her gaze shifted briefly to Ethan, something unspoken passing between them, something that suggested this situation extended beyond what had been seen so far. "You should be careful," she added, her attention returning to Amara, "because in this world, perception is everything." Amara did not look away, did not step back, did not soften her stance. "Then I suggest you look more carefully," she replied. And this time, there was no mistaking the shift, the subtle but undeniable change in the balance of the conversation. Because this was no longer about introduction, no longer about assumption. It was about recognition, and for the first time since Victoria had approached, there was a pause in her composure, brief, controlled, but present, as if something did not align with the expectation she had carried into the moment. "Interesting," she said after a second, her tone lighter now, but her eyes sharper, more focused. "You are not what I expected." And Amara's response was immediate, not rushed, not defensive, just certain. "That seems to be a pattern," she said, and Ethan felt it then. The shift he had been sensing since the beginning, but had not fully understood. The way the conversation had moved beyond his control, beyond the structure he had assumed would hold. And for a moment, he said nothing, because there was nothing to add that would not disrupt something he needed to see play out. Victoria's gaze lingered on Amara a second longer, as if reassessing, recalculating. And then she stepped back slightly, the movement small, but significant. "Enjoy your evening," she said, her tone returning to its earlier smoothness. But the edge remained, subtle, controlled, and as she turned to leave, the space around them seemed to exhale, conversations resuming, the rhythm of the gala re-establishing itself as if nothing had happened. But the shift remained, quiet but undeniable. "You handled that differently than expected," Ethan said after a moment, his voice low, measured, and Amara turned her gaze to him, her expression unchanged. "You expected something else," she replied, and he did not deny it, because the truth was evident. "Most people would have been intimidated," he said, and she considered that for a moment, not dismissing it, not accepting it, just acknowledging it as a perspective. "Most people rely on intimidation to maintain order," she said, and the statement was simple, but it carried an understanding that went deeper than the surface of the interaction they had just witnessed, and Ethan watched her, really watched her, not as part of a situation, not as a role within a contract, but as a person who continued to reveal layers he had not anticipated. "You speak like someone who has been in rooms like this before," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, just observation, curiosity, and she held his gaze for a moment, just long enough to make the answer feel deliberate. "Everyone has been somewhere before," she replied, and the ambiguity of it did not feel like avoidance. It felt like choice, like she was deciding how much to reveal and when. And for the first time since this began, Ethan realized something he had not considered, that whatever he thought he understood about her was incomplete. And as the evening continued, as the lights dimmed slightly and the music shifted, one thought settled into place with quiet certainty. This was no longer a situation he could define on his own, because the more he observed, the clearer it became. He was not the only one who had entered this arrangement with intention, and whatever her reason was, it had not yet been revealed. "Careful what you say next," a voice murmured behind her, low enough that only Amara could hear it. And she did not turn immediately, did not acknowledge it right away, because the room had already begun to shift again, the kind of shift that did not announce itself, but moved through people like a quiet current, changing the direction of conversations, pulling attention towards something unseen. And when she finally glanced over her shoulder, the man standing there was not smiling, not openly hostile either, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was not here for small talk. "You are attracting the wrong kind of attention," he added, his tone calm, almost polite, but the words carried a weight that made them feel like more than a warning. And Amara studied him for a brief moment, taking in the details, the tailored suit, the watch that reflected the soft lighting, the confidence that came from knowing he belonged in this world without question, that assumes there is a right kind, she replied, her voice even, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not in amusement, but in acknowledgement, as if he recognized something in her response that did not match what he expected. "You are new here," he said, "so let me make it simple. People like you do not stay in places like this unless someone allows it." And there it was, the line drawn not with anger, but with certainty, the kind of certainty that had been reinforced by years of watching the same patterns repeat. And for a moment, Amara said nothing, not because she was unsure, but because she was deciding how much of herself to reveal, how much of the truth to let surface in a room that was not built to hear it. "Then I suppose we will find out who is making that decision," she said finally, and something in the air changed, subtle but undeniable, because this was not defiance, not in the way he understood it. It was something steadier, something rooted in a confidence that did not need to raise its voice. And before he could respond, Ethan stepped closer, his presence cutting through the moment with quiet authority. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone controlled, but there was a sharpness beneath it now, something that suggested he had been watching more closely than anyone realized. The man's expression shifted instantly, the tension smoothing out into something more neutral, more acceptable. "Not at all," he said, stepping back slightly, "just offering some advice." And Ethan's gaze lingered on him for a second longer than necessary, not challenging, but not dismissing either. And then he turned his attention to Amara, his expression unreadable. "Enjoy the evening," the man added before walking away, his departure quiet but deliberate, as if he had said everything he intended to say. And for a moment, neither Ethan nor Amara spoke, the silence between them different from the others, not uncertain, not tense, but aware, as if both of them were processing the same realization from different angles. "You seem to have a talent for shifting conversations," Ethan said finally, his voice low, measured, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "Conversations reveal themselves," she replied, and the distinction was subtle, but it mattered, because it suggested she was not creating conflict, she was exposing it, and that was something far more difficult to control. That was not just a conversation, he said, his tone sharpening slightly. That was a warning. And for the first time that evening, there was something in his voice that resembled concern, not for himself, but for the situation as a whole, and she considered that for a moment, her expression unchanged. Warnings are only effective if they are understood, she said, and he studied her, trying to determine whether she was dismissing the risk or simply choosing not to react to it, and he could not tell, which unsettled him more than he expected. You are not taking this seriously, he said, and she held his gaze, steady, unflinching. I am taking it exactly as seriously as it deserves, she replied. And there it was again, that quiet certainty, the sense that she was operating with information he did not yet have. And it made the situation feel less like something he had initiated and more like something he had stepped into without fully understanding. You should stay close tonight, he said after a moment, the words coming out more deliberate than he intended, and for a second, something flickered in her expression, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, as if she understood the shift in his tone, the change in his approach. Is that a request or an instruction? She asked, and he did not hesitate this time. Both, he said, and the answer settled between them, clear, direct. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the noise of the gala continuing around them, but somehow distant, as if the rest of the room had faded into the background. And then she nodded once, not in submission, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then I will consider it, she said, and before he could respond, the lights shifted slightly, the music lowering just enough to signal a change in the evening's rhythm, attention drawing toward the center of the room where a speaker was preparing to address the crowd. And as people began to gather, as conversations paused and bodies repositioned, Ethan felt it again, that subtle but persistent shift, the sense that the evening was building towards something he had not planned, something that extended beyond the bet, beyond the contract, beyond the control he had assumed he would maintain. And as he glanced at Amara, standing beside him with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning, one thought settled into place, clearer now than before. Whatever was coming next, it was not going to follow the rules he had set, and for the first time since this began, he was no longer certain he was prepared for it. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate legacy. The speaker's voice carried smoothly across the ballroom, drawing every eye toward the stage, and as the room settled into attentive silence, the shift in energy became undeniable, the kind of shift that signaled something more than a simple announcement, something planned, something deliberate. Ethan stood still beside Amara, his posture controlled but his attention sharpened, because he recognized this tone, this structure, the way an evening like this could be redirected with just a few carefully chosen words. We gather not only to honor achievement, the speaker continued, but to recognize the individuals who shaped the future of this city. Applause followed, polite, measured, but beneath it, there was anticipation, a sense that something more specific was coming, and Ethan felt it before he understood it. That quiet instinct that had guided him through negotiations and boardrooms, telling him when a moment was about to turn. And sometimes, the speaker added, pausing just long enough to draw the room in closer, those individuals surprise us. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, subtle but present, and Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, scanning the room, measuring reactions, searching for the source of the shift he could feel building. Tonight, the speaker said, we acknowledge a decision that has captured the attention of many. And there it was, the pivot, the moment where the focus narrowed, where the room's curiosity aligned in a single direction, and Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, not visibly, but enough to register internally, because he understood now. This was not coincidence. This was intention. Mr. Ethan Cole, the speaker continued, your recent marriage has certainly sparked conversation. Light laughter followed, controlled, polite, but carrying an edge that made the moment feel less like recognition and more like examination. And beside him, Amara remained still, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the shifting energy around them. And in a world where perception often defines reality, the speaker added, we are all curious to understand the story behind such a bold choice. The pause before the final words was subtle, but it carried weight, and the room responded accordingly, attention sharpening, eyes turning, waiting, and Ethan felt the pressure of it, not as discomfort, but as awareness, the recognition that this was a moment designed to test him, to test them, to see how the narrative would be shaped in real time. "Would you care to share a few words?" the speaker asked, gesturing toward them, and for a second, the room held its breath, the silence stretching just long enough to make the expectation clear. Ethan stepped forward slightly, his movement controlled, deliberate, the kind of confidence that had carried him through countless public appearances. But this time, something was different, something less predictable, because this was not just about him anymore. "Of course," he said, his voice steady as he took the microphone, his gaze sweeping the room with practiced ease, acknowledging the attention without being defined by it. "I understand the curiosity," he began, his tone calm, measured. "It is not every day that a decision like this is made in such a visible way." A few quiet chuckles followed, but they did not carry the same weight as before, because the room was listening more closely now, searching for something beneath the surface. "But I assure you," he continued, "this is not a spectacle." His words were clear, deliberate, but as he spoke them, he became aware of something he had not expected, the way they felt less like a statement and more like a choice, a decision being made in the moment rather than repeated from a script. "This is a commitment," he added, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze shifted, landing on Amara, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them, something unspoken, something that neither of them had fully defined yet, but both of them recognized. And then he turned back to the room. "And as with any commitment," he said, "it deserves to be understood on its own terms." The words settled into the space, not loud, not forceful, but firm enough to shift the tone of the moment, to redirect the narrative just slightly. But before he could continue, a voice cut through the room, not raised, not aggressive, but clear enough to interrupt. "Then perhaps we should hear from her." The attention shifted instantly, the room pivoting toward Amara with a renewed focus. Sharper now, more direct, and Ethan felt it again, that subtle loss of control, the realization that this moment was no longer his to manage alone, and for a second, he hesitated, not visibly, but internally, because this was not part of the plan, not part of the structure he had anticipated. And then Amara moved, not quickly, not hesitantly, just enough to step forward, her presence steady as she joined him, her gaze lifting to meet the room without flinching, without shrinking, without adjusting herself to fit the expectation being placed upon her. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, carrying across the space without effort. "There is no story," she said, and the simplicity of the statement created a pause, a moment where the room seemed to recalibrate, because it was not the answer they had expected, not the explanation they had prepared to analyze. "There is only a decision," she continued, her tone even, "and like any decision, it belongs to the people who made it." The words settled differently than Ethan's had, not reinforcing the structure, but redefining it, removing the room's authority to interpret, to judge, to assign meaning beyond what was given. And for a moment, the silence that followed was complete, not uncertain, not tense, but clear, as if something had been drawn into focus that could not easily be undone. And as Ethan stood beside her, listening, observing, one realization settled into place with undeniable clarity. This was no longer about defending a choice. It was about understanding it. And for the first time since this began, he was no longer certain that he was the one who understood it best. "You do realize what you just did." Ethan's voice was low as they stepped away from the stage, the applause behind them polite, but thinner now, as if the room was still processing what had just happened. And Amara did not answer immediately, her gaze steady as she moved through the crowd, the same calm presence she had carried all night. But something in the air had changed, something sharper, more focused, the kind of attention that did not fade easily. "You shifted the entire narrative," he continued, his tone controlled. "But there was something beneath it now, something closer to tension than authority. That was not part of the plan," she replied, her voice even, and he let out a quiet breath. Not quite frustration, not quite disbelief, but something in between. "There was a plan," he said, and she turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Then it was incomplete, she answered, and for a second, he did not respond, because the statement was not wrong, not entirely. But it was not something he was used to hearing, not in situations he had initiated, not in environments he had designed to operate within his control, and yet here they were, standing in the middle of a room that no longer felt entirely predictable. "You should have let me handle it," he said after a moment. And this time, there was no mistaking the edge in his voice, not anger, but something sharper, something that suggested he was no longer entirely comfortable with how the situation was unfolding. "You were handling it," she replied, her tone steady. "I chose to speak." And the distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, because it made it clear that she was not reacting to him. She was acting independently, and that was not part of the structure he had built. "This is not just about speaking," he said, his voice lowering further. "This is about control." And she held his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged. "Control is only effective when it is understood," she said, echoing her earlier words. And something in that repetition made the moment feel more deliberate, more intentional, as if she was not just responding, but reinforcing a perspective he had not yet fully grasped. "And what exactly do you understand?" he asked, the question coming out more direct than he intended. And for the first time, she paused, not out of hesitation, but out of choice, as if she was deciding whether this was the moment to reveal something more, something deeper than the surface they had been navigating so far. "I understand that this was never just a bet," she said finally, her voice calm, but carrying a clarity that made the words feel heavier than they sounded. And he frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, because part of him already knew that, had known at the moment she did not react the way he expected. "Then what is it?" he asked, and the question hung between them, not rushed, not forced, but real in a way that their previous exchanges had not been, and she met his gaze steadily, her eyes holding something he could not immediately define. "That depends on how much you are willing to see," she replied, and the answer was not direct, not complete, but it was enough to shift something inside him, enough to make him realize that whatever this situation was becoming, it extended beyond the boundaries he had set at the beginning. "You keep doing that," he said quietly, answering without answering. And for the first time, there was something in his tone that resembled curiosity more than control, and she allowed the faintest hint of a smile, not dismissive, not evasive, but knowing. "And you keep asking questions you are not ready for," she replied, and the exchange settled into a silence that felt different from the others, not tense, not uncertain, but charged with a kind of awareness that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. The kind that builds slowly, quietly, until it can no longer be ignored. "You are not who you say you are," he said after a moment, the words not accusatory, but observational, as if he had been arriving at this conclusion piece by piece, and was now finally giving it form. And she did not deny it, did not confirm it, simply held his gaze with the same steady composure she had maintained from the beginning. "Neither are you," she replied, and the response landed with a different kind of weight. Because it was not deflection, it was reflection, a reminder that whatever assumptions he had made about her, she had likely made about him as well, and that realization shifted something, subtle but significant, because it removed the imbalance he had relied on, replaced it with something more equal, more uncertain. "This was supposed to be simple," he said, almost to himself, and she tilted her head slightly, considering the statement. "Simple does not mean easy," she replied. And the distinction lingered, settling into the space between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the noise of the gala continuing around them, but somehow distant, as if they were standing slightly outside of it, observing rather than participating. And then, without warning, the room shifted again, not in sound, not in light, but in attention, the kind of shift that signaled something new was about to unfold, and Ethan felt it immediately, his posture tightening just slightly, his focus sharpening as his gaze moved across the room, searching for the source. "It seems your evening is not over yet," Amara said quietly, and he followed her line of sight, his expression changing just enough to signal recognition. And as the next moment began to take shape, one realization settled into place with quiet certainty. Whatever this was, whatever it had become, it was no longer something he could control alone. and for the first time since this began, he was not entirely sure he wanted to. You should not have come tonight. The voice was quieter than the others, not sharp, not mocking, but it carried a weight that made Ethan stop before he even turned. And when he did, the man standing there was older, composed, the kind of presence that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. I was invited, Ethan replied, his tone controlled, but there was something different now, something less automatic, as if the situation had already begun to shift beyond his usual responses. Invitations can be strategic, the man said, his gaze moving briefly past Ethan, settling on Amara with a level of focus that felt deliberate, calculated, and for the first time that evening, there was a pause in her stillness, not visible the most, but enough for Ethan to notice, enough to confirm what he had begun to suspect. This was not random, and you must be the one everyone is talking about. The man continued, addressing Amara directly now, his tone polite, but carrying an undercurrent that suggested familiarity rather than curiosity, and she met his gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged. That depends on what they are saying, she replied, and the response landed with quiet precision, neither accepting nor rejecting the assumption, but reframing it, and the man's expression shifted slightly, not surprised, but interested, as if something in her words aligned with expectations he had not yet revealed. They are saying many things, he said, but very few of them are accurate, and for a moment, the space between them felt narrower, more focused, as if the rest of the room had faded into the background, leaving only this exchange, this moment that carried more weight than the others. Accuracy tends to depend on perspective, Amara replied, and the calm in her voice did not waver, even as the tension beneath the conversation deepened, and Ethan watched, not interrupting, not stepping in, because something told him this was not a conversation he could control, not one he should interrupt. Perspective is often shaped by history, the man said, his eyes still on Amara, and there it was, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the introduction of something beyond the present, something that reached further back, and for the first time since this began, Ethan felt it clearly, the realization that whatever connection existed here, it did not start tonight, and history, Amara said quietly, has a way of revealing itself, and the words settled between them, heavier than anything else that had been spoken, because they carried implication, intention, something that had not yet been fully expressed, and the man nodded once, a small, controlled movement, as if acknowledging a point that had not needed to be explained. It seems you understand that better than most, he said, and then his gaze shifted briefly to Ethan, something passing between them, something unspoken but clear enough to register. You may want to reconsider your position, he added, his tone still calm, still measured, but now directed at Ethan, and the words did not feel like advice. They felt like a warning, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in reaction, but in recognition, because he understood what it meant when someone like this chose to speak so directly. I do not make decisions lightly, he replied, his voice steady, but there was a new edge beneath it now, something that suggested he was no longer entirely certain of the ground he was standing on. No, the man said, but you may not have had all the information, and with that, he stepped back. The movement subtle, but it created distance, space, as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, even if the implications had not. And as he turned and disappeared into the crowd, the room seemed to return to its previous rhythm, conversations resuming, the music rising slightly, the illusion of normalcy re-establishing itself, but the shift remained, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. You know him, Ethan said after a moment, his voice lower now, more focused, and she did not deny it, did not hesitate, simply met his gaze with the same steady composure she had maintained from the beginning. Yes, she said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, and he pressed, not out of impatience, but because the question had already formed before he could stop it, and she considered him for a moment, her expression unchanged. And you are asking questions you are not ready for, she replied, echoing her earlier words. But this time, they felt different, heavier, more immediate, and for a second, he almost argued, almost pushed further. But something stopped him, something in the way. She said it, something in the certainty behind it. "This is not just about you," he said instead, his tone quieter now, more deliberate, and she held his gaze, not confirming, not denying, but acknowledging the shift in his understanding. "No," she said, "it never was," and the truth of it settled into the space between them, clear, undeniable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the gala continuing around them, but somehow distant, as if they were standing at the edge of something that had not yet fully revealed itself. And as Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, not as part of a situation, not as a role within a contract, but as someone who had entered this arrangement with purpose, one realization settled into place with undeniable clarity. He had not chosen her, not in the way he had believed, and whatever this was becoming, it had been set in motion long before he ever spoke that first word. "So this is where it ends," Ethan said quietly once they were back inside the penthouse, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass walls, lights flickering like distant signals in the dark, and for the first time since the night had begun, the silence between them was not filled with observation, not layered with tension from outside forces, but something more direct, more personal. And Amara stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her posture as steady as ever. But there was a shift now, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if something long held in place was finally ready to move. "No," she replied, her voice calm. "This is where it becomes clear." And he let out a breath, slower this time, his composure still intact but no longer untouched, because the pieces had begun to connect in a way he could not ignore. "You knew," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and she turned slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I understood enough," she answered, and the distinction mattered, because it suggested intention without full disclosure, preparation without complete control, and that unsettled him more than anything else had so far. "You walked into this," he continued, his tone sharper now, not in anger, but in clarity. "Not because of the bet, not because of the money, but because of something else," and she held his gaze, the silence stretching just long enough to confirm what he already knew. "Yes," she said, and the simplicity of the answer carried weight, because it removed any doubt, any illusion that this had been accidental. "Then tell me what this really is," he said, stepping closer now, not aggressively, but with purpose, the need for understanding overriding the control he had relied on for so long. And for a moment, she said nothing, her eyes steady, her expression composed. But there was something behind it now, something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to ask the right question. "Your company," she began slowly, her voice even, "expanded 5 years ago into sectors that were not originally part of its structure, and the shift was immediate, the conversation moving from personal to something broader, something rooted in fact rather than assumption," and Ethan's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to signal recognition, because he knew exactly what she was referring to. "That is public record," he said, his tone guarded now, more careful, and she nodded once. "Yes," she said, "but the consequences are not." And the words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything that had been spoken before, because they carried implication, something that extended beyond business, beyond strategy, into something more personal, more direct. "There were companies that did not survive that expansion," she continued, her gaze never leaving his, "families that lost everything." And the room felt different now, not physically, but in the weight of the conversation, in the shift from what had been to what was being revealed, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not deflect, because he understood the significance of what she was saying, even if he did not yet understand why she was saying it. "And you think that has something to do with me," he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled. And she considered him for a moment, not dismissing, not accusing, just acknowledging the complexity of the situation. "I think you are part of a system that made those decisions," she replied, and the distinction was precise, careful, not placing blame directly, but not removing responsibility either. And for a second, he almost argued, almost pushed back against the implication, but something stopped him, something in the way she spoke, the absence of anger, the presence of certainty. "And this," he said, gesturing slightly between them, "this is what exactly. And this time, she did not pause, did not hesitate, because this was the moment everything had been leading to. This is accountability, she said, and the words settled into the room with quiet finality, because it reframed everything. The bet, the contract, the marriage, turning them from something trivial into something intentional, something deliberate. And for the first time since this began, Ethan felt it fully, the shift in power, not through force, not through confrontation, but through understanding. You planned this, he said, not accusing, but acknowledging, and she met his gaze steadily. I prepared for the opportunity, she replied. And again, the distinction mattered, because it suggested that while she had not controlled every detail, she had been ready for the moment when it arrived. And now? He asked, his voice lower now, more focused, and she turned slightly, her gaze moving briefly toward the city beyond the glass before returning to him. Now you decide what kind of man you are, she said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, because they shifted the responsibility back to him, removed any illusion that this was something being done to him rather than something he was now part of. And for a moment, the silence that followed was complete, not uncertain, not tense, but clear, as if everything had finally been laid out in a way that could not be ignored. And as Ethan stood there, processing, understanding, one realization settled into place with undeniable clarity. This was never about the bet, never about the spectacle. It was about what came after, about the choice that followed the truth. And for the first time since this began, he understood exactly what was at stake. So what happens now? Ethan's voice was quieter than it had ever been, not because he lacked control, but because control no longer felt like the most important thing in the room, and Amara stood across from him, the city lights behind her casting a soft glow that made everything feel still, suspended between what had been and what could be. And for a moment, she did not answer, not out of hesitation, but because the question itself mattered, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about choosing. Now, she said finally, you decide if any of this changes you. And the simplicity of the words carried more weight than anything else she had said that night, because it placed the outcome entirely in his hands, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as a truth. And Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping for a second before returning to her, not searching anymore, not questioning, but recognizing the distance between who he had been when this started and who he was now, standing here, understanding something he had never been forced to see before. And if it does? He asked. And there was no arrogance left in the question, no assumption of control, just something honest, something real. And she held his gaze, steady as always, but softer now, not in weakness, but in clarity. Then it was worth it, she replied, and the words settled between them, quiet but undeniable, because they reframed everything, not as a confrontation, not as a manipulation, but as a moment that had meaning beyond itself. And for a second, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, of realization, of something that had been building from the very beginning and had finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. You could have exposed everything, he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful now, measured in a different way. You could have taken this further. And she considered that, not dismissing it, not denying it, just acknowledging it as a possibility that had existed. I could have, she said, but that would not have changed anything. And he frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in reflection, because he understood what she meant. That exposure without understanding was just another form of control, another way to force an outcome without changing the foundation beneath it. So this was never about revenge, he said, and she shook her head once, the movement. Small but certain. No, she replied. It was about choice. And there it was again. That word, simple, clear, but carrying more weight than anything else in the room, because it removed blame, removed assumption, replaced them with something more difficult, something that required action rather than reaction. Then I have a choice to make, he said, more to himself than to her. And for the first time since this began, the statement felt real, not like a continuation of a decision already made, but the beginning of something new, something he had not planned, had not controlled, but now had to face. And she nodded once, not encouraging, not pushing, just acknowledging the truth of it. Yes, she said. And then she stepped back slightly, creating space between them, not as distance, but as an opportunity, as a moment for him to stand on his own without the structure of the situation guiding him. And Ethan watched her, the way she moved, the way she carried herself, the same quiet strength that had been there from the beginning. But now he saw it differently, not as something unusual, not as something to analyze, but as something to respect. You are not staying, he said, the realization coming not from her words, but from the shift in her posture, the subtle change in the space between them. And she met his gaze, her expression calm. But there was something final in it now, something that suggested this part of the story was reaching its natural conclusion. I was never here to stay, she replied, and the truth of it did not feel like rejection, did not feel like loss. It felt like completion, like something that had fulfilled its purpose and was now ready to move forward. Then why does it feel like you are leaving something behind? He asked, and the question came out before he could stop it. Not calculated, not controlled, just real. And for a moment, she did not answer, her gaze softening just slightly as she looked at him, not as part of a situation, not as someone she needed to challenge or confront, but as someone who had reached a point of understanding. Because I am, she said quietly. I am leaving you with the truth. And the words settled into the space between them, not heavy, not overwhelming, but steady, something that would remain long after she was gone. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the city outside continuing as it always had, unaware of the shift that had taken place within these walls. And then she turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a simple movement, a decision made and carried out without hesitation. And as she walked toward the door, Ethan did not stop her, not because he could not, but because he understood that this was not a moment to control, it was a moment to accept. And as the door closed behind her, the quiet that followed was different from any silence he had known before, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something new, something he had not planned for but could no longer ignore. And as he stood there, looking out at the city that suddenly felt larger than it had before, one realization settled into place with quiet certainty. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment it truly began.